Close your eyes for just a moment and imagine a city that has been building itself century by century for 1400 years. You are about to walk through all of it, from the very first axe that broke ground in an English forest to the medieval markets that first put this place on the map, from the waterways that once carried the wealth of a nation to the proud Victorian streets that still stand at the edge of a new century. This is Birmingham, and this is its story. What you are about to see has been reconstructed using artificial intelligence, drawn from historical engravings, period paintings, and archival records. Every image is grounded in real sources. This is history, rendered as faithfully as we are able to bring it back. We began with what time left behind: maps drawn by hand, engravings carved in wood, sketches made by those who were there. From those fragments, these worlds have been rebuilt. What was once faded and flat now walks and breathes again. So let us go back, all the way back, to the very beginning. This is where it started, at the edge of a forest, beside a stream, in the land that became Birmingham. Birmingham stands here because of that decision. Come with me, 14 centuries back, to where it all began. This is what they found. No roads, no walls, just open heath, ancient trees, and a stream running free. The first act was simple and hard. Axes into oak, ground broken by hand. The forest did not give easily. Slowly, something took shape, not from any written plan, but from the knowledge of where a family could survive, post by post, beam by beam. Where trees had stood, walls now rose. This land was taking shape. They called it Birmingham, the home of Beorma's people. And from this muddy hillside, Birmingham began. It is the early 600s. The Anglo-Saxons have settled across England, carving farmland from ancient forest. The Kingdom of Mercia dominates this region, a powerful Anglo-Saxon kingdom stretching from the Thames to the Humber. Birmingham sits at the heart of Mercia, not on a river, not on a Roman road, just a clearing in the wilderness. Generation by generation, the settlement grew. Other families arrived, drawn by the land, by safety, and by the feeling that this place could become home. But then the Vikings came. Across the northern seas, a new danger was gathering, carried by long ships, hardened warriors, and the cold winds moving toward England. What had once seemed like scattered raids was becoming something larger. Fleets, leaders, and fighting men moving with purpose across the water. Then, in 865, the great heathen army arrived, not as a small raiding party, but as a force large enough to shake kingdoms. From the coasts and river mouths, the pressure moved inland, toward Mercia, the Midlands, and the small settlements hidden within them. Birmingham was spared the worst. It had no wealth worth raiding. Its very poverty was its protection. But King Alfred the Great would finally turn the tide. He broke the Viking advance, restoring the Kingdom of Mercia. At last, the quiet people of Birmingham were free to grow in peace. Following the death of Alfred the Great, power passed to Edward the Elder. By the year 1000, Birmingham was a small but established settlement, with a church, farmland, and a community. 4 decades into this new age, the ancient crown of Alfred finds its master in Edward. In 1042, a new era began to take shape. For 20 years, a golden peace held England together, but beneath the splendor, a fatal void grew. The king had no heir to hold the realm. The long era of peace finally shattered. King Edward drew his final breath. Harold Godwinson was quickly crowned king, but his reign was built on shifting sands across the sea. A storm gathered. Then, in 1066, everything changed. William the Conqueror arrived from Normandy, and England was never the same again. Riding along the misty coast, the Norman Duke raised his blade for war. Pushing inland, his army confronted the last Saxon king. Two massive forces violently collided, deciding the fate of a kingdom. After a day of brutal combat, the Saxon shield wall broke. Harold's final defenders lay shattered on the earth. On this quiet ground, tradition remembered the fall of Harold and the passing of Anglo-Saxon England. The Saxon line broke. William, now the Conqueror, began his ruthless march across a broken kingdom. In 1086, William ordered the Domesday Book, a complete survey of every settlement in England. The entry is brief. Birmingham had just a few families, modest farmland, and a value of 20 shillings, barely notable. The de Birmingham family, Norman lords, took control of this small manor and built their castle here. Everything was about to change. The de Birminghams would shape this town for centuries. Their decision to hold a market would change its destiny. In 1166, Peter de Birmingham received the royal charter, the right to hold a weekly market. This was the turning point. By the 13th century, Birmingham had a proper church, St. Martin's, standing beside the muddy market at the Bull Ring. Over the following centuries, that market grew around the church, busier, wider, and more important to everyday town life. By the early 19th century, the Bull Ring had become a recognizable urban center, with St. Martin's still marking its heart. The de Birminghams expanded the market, added a fair, and built a manor house, the foundations of a proper town. Then came 1349, the Black Death. It killed a third of England's population in under 2 years. In Birmingham, the death toll was devastating. Half the town may have died. Fields stood empty. Forges went cold. Yet Birmingham recovered, faster than many towns. Why? Because metalwork requires fewer workers than farming. Smaller teams could restart a forge. By the 1380s, Birmingham's market was thriving again. Demand for metal goods had only grown. War and recovery both needed iron. The town grew outward. New streets, new crafts. Weavers and tanners joined the metalworkers, creating a layered economy. The de Birminghams continued to hold power, hosting the great Michaelmas Fair that drew traders from as far as London. But as the 15th century closed, the era of local lords began to die. In 1509, King Henry VIII ascended to absolute power. Under his ruthless Tudor regime, ancient local families became prey. By 1536, the de Birminghams, who built this town from the mud, were framed and stripped of everything. Their reign was over. His iron fist struck again. The dissolution of the monasteries shattered the old order, bringing chaos and new opportunities. The monastery lands around Birmingham were sold off, bought by local merchants and gentry. A new class of landowners arrived. The 1500s brought Tudor England, a new dynasty, new trade routes, and a town ready to grow. John Leland, the royal antiquary, visited Birmingham in 1538 and described it as a fine town, famous for its ironwork. He recorded, "The town's metalwork has grown remarkably diverse. Now they forge sharp blades, ornate spurs, and complex locks, essential tools and fittings exported to every corner of the king's realm." By 1563, the population had reached around 1,500 people, 12 times what William found when he wrote the Domesday Book. Wealth was uneven. Wealthy merchants lived in fine timber houses, while the poor crammed into courts and alleys behind the main streets. By the late 1500s, Birmingham was producing enough blades to supply English armies, a crucial shift from local market to national supplier. In 1588, England faced the Spanish Armada at sea. Behind that battle stood metalwork, blades, tools and weapons from towns like Birmingham. But the 1600s would bring the most dangerous moment in Birmingham's history, not from a foreign army, but from within England itself. In 1625, the crown fell to Charles I. Never meant to be king, until his older brother's sudden death, Charles ascended with a dangerous arrogance, completely disconnected from his people. By 1640, England was fiercely divided. King Charles believed in his divine right to rule absolutely, but Parliament did not. Birmingham was a parliamentarian town. Its merchants and craftsmen largely opposed the king. They had a reason. Birmingham's metal workers had been supplying the king's armies for decades, but now they faced a choice. Whose swords would they make? They chose Parliament. Birmingham would arm the rebellion and pay a terrible price for it. To understand why the Civil War happened, you need to understand one man and one idea. Charles I believed that God had made him king, and that Parliament had no right to question him. When Charles tried to impose his version of the Church of England on Scotland, they rebelled, and England ran out of money to fight them. To pay for his wars, Charles was forced to recall Parliament, the very Parliament that despised him. This was the moment the crisis became unstoppable. In August 1642, Charles raised his royal standard at Nottingham, declaring war on his own Parliament. England split in two: the Royalist Cavaliers, loyal to the king, against the parliamentarian Roundheads. Prince Rupert of the Rhine, Charles's brilliant but ruthless cavalry commander, was ordered to take Birmingham. In April 1643, 2,000 Royalist cavalry and infantry marched toward Birmingham. The townspeople knew they were coming. Birmingham had perhaps 140 musketeers to defend the entire town. This was an impossible fight, but they chose to make it. The two armies faced each other at Camp Hill, on the southern approach to the town. The ground was open. The odds were impossible. The cavalry alone numbered over 1,000, spread wide across the hillside, waiting for the signal to charge. The parliamentarian musketeers opened fire first, a defiant volley that momentarily slowed the advance. The flanking cavalry numbered in the hundreds, a wall of horses and iron moving at speed across open ground. Over 100 homes were burned. 80 families lost everything. The sound of the fire could be heard for miles. The Civil War dragged on for 3 more years. Birmingham continued to supply Parliament, quietly, persistently. In June 1645, at Naseby, the fate of the English monarchy was written upon a chessboard of blood. Two armies stood face to face, arrayed in a deadly silence before the thunderstorm of war erupted. Diplomacy had failed. Now, there were only the desperate screams of the dying, the acrid stench of sulfur, and the deafening clash of steel. This was no glorious victory. It was a brutal, fratricidal hell on earth. As the smoke cleared, the royalist cause lay in ruins. The crown of Charles I was shattered beyond repair. Power now belonged to those who forged their destiny with cold iron and bitter blood. King Charles was captured in 1646. He surrendered to the Scottish army, who handed him to Parliament. In January 1649, Charles I was put on trial. the first time a reigning English monarch faced justice before a court. He was ultimately condemned for high treason, his final moments forever etched into history. On the cold morning of January 30th, 1649, King Charles I was beheaded outside Whitehall. England was now a republic, a Commonwealth without a king. Across the barren landscape, a cold, uncertain era began. The Commonwealth lasted only 11 years. In 1660, Parliament invited Charles II back from exile, and the monarchy returned to England. For Birmingham, the Restoration meant freedom to trade again, without the restrictions Parliament had imposed on commerce. The late 1600s brought something new, religious tolerance, at least compared to the wars that had just passed. Birmingham became a haven for nonconformists. Quakers, Baptists, Presbyterians, these dissenting communities brought a powerful work ethic. Quaker merchants were particularly important. They built networks of trust across England, trading honestly and efficiently. By 1700, Birmingham's population had reached around 15,000, a tenfold increase in a century. The town had outgrown its medieval street plan. New streets were being cut through older properties to ease the flow of commerce. One man above all others defined this era, Matthew Boulton. Born in 1728, son of a toy trade manufacturer, he would transform Birmingham. At 21, Boulton inherited his father's business and immediately began expanding it beyond anything his father had imagined. Birmingham's canal had not yet arrived, but the roads were improving. Goods moved by pack horse to London, Bristol, and Liverpool. The quality of Birmingham's metalwork was becoming famous. Visitors from London came north just to see the workshops and to place orders. In 1761, the Birmingham Canal Act was passed. The canal was coming. Birmingham would finally be connected to the national water network. The canal would change everything. But before it arrived, one more revolution was beginning. A revolution of ideas. Among them, Matthew Boulton, James Watt, Erasmus Darwin, Joseph Priestley, and Josiah Wedgwood. This was the most important dinner table in England. Joseph Priestley, who lived in Birmingham, discovered oxygen in 1774 in a laboratory funded by Boulton and his friends. While Priestley discovered oxygen, James Watt, working in Boulton's factory, was perfecting the steam engine. Watt's engine was not just better, it was transformational. It could pump water from mines, drive machinery, and power mills. When Soho Manufactory opened its massive gates in 1762, it marked a point of no return. It was a sprawling cathedral of industry, completely unlike anything England had ever seen before. The Birmingham Canal opened in 1769, and overnight, the cost of transporting goods dropped by 70%. In the decades that followed, Birmingham's canals became more than waterways. They became industrial roads, carrying coal, iron, timber, and finished goods through the heart of the Midlands. Next came the American War of Independence, a distant conflict, but one that created a new demand for arms. Then came the wars with France, Revolution, Napoleon, and Britain's need for weapons grew even further. Birmingham's gun trade, already skilled, specialized, and well-connected, became part of Britain's war machine. By 1790, Birmingham's gun quarter was producing over 100,000 muskets per year. Meanwhile, Matthew Boulton had taken on another enormous project, solving the problem of counterfeit coins. Counterfeiting was a national crisis in 1780s England. Nearly half of all copper coins in circulation were fakes. Bolton designed a steam-powered coining press, so precise and fast that counterfeiting became impossible. The Soho Mint produced coins for Britain, India, Russia, and 16 other nations. Birmingham was minting the world's money. In 1791, Birmingham was rocked by the priestly riots, the most violent outbreak of civil unrest the town had seen since the Civil War. The trigger, a dinner commemorating the French Revolution. The mob suspected the Lunar Society men of being Jacobin revolutionaries. Joseph Priestley's house and laboratory were destroyed. He fled Birmingham and never returned. By the end, 4 people were dead. In only 2 nights, more than 24 buildings were destroyed. The targets were not random. Homes, meeting houses, and places linked to Birmingham's dissenters were broken, burned, and left in ruins, as politics, fear, and fire scarred the town. The riots shocked the nation, but they also showed Birmingham's tensions. Progress and inequality were growing side by side. By 1800, Birmingham was a true industrial city. The population had passed 70,000, and it was still growing fast. The slave trade funded much of England's commercial expansion, and Birmingham was not untouched by it. Birmingham's Quaker community was among the first in England to campaign actively for the abolition of slavery. The iconic "Am I Not a Man and a Brother?" medallion was designed by Wedgwood, part of the Lunar Society network, and distributed from Birmingham. By 1800, Birmingham's metalworkers had produced goods that were in every corner of the globe, from Caribbean plantations to Indian palaces. This was a city built on iron and ingenuity, but also on the backs of workers who had no vote, no union, and no protection. The tension between employer and worker would define the next century, but in 1800, that battle had barely begun. The Birmingham town centre was being rebuilt in brick and stone. A new street commission, the first form of local government, was improving roads and lighting. As the streets improved, Birmingham centre became more than a marketplace. Hotels, inns, coaches, and shops turned it into a town built for movement, trade, and visitors. Gas street lighting arrived in Birmingham in 1819. The streets, for the first time, were safe to walk at night. The old market centre around St. Martin's was becoming overcrowded. The new commercial centre began to shift northward toward New Street. The Midland Bank, the town's first proper bank, opened in 1836, channeling the wealth of industry into further investment. By the 1830s, Birmingham was producing not just goods, but ideas, philosophical, political, and economic debates that would shape the nation. Across Birmingham, the call for reform was no longer confined to private rooms or public halls. It had moved into the open air. In 1832, the Reform Act gave Birmingham 2 members of Parliament for the first time, a political voice for an industrial town that could no longer be ignored. By the 1830s, Birmingham was entering the railway age. At the station gates, steam, stone, and iron announced a quieter kind of revolution. The railway crossed open fields and deep cuttings, shortening old distances and bringing towns, markets, families, and work closer together. Looking ahead from the engine, Britain no longer seemed so distant or still. The country was beginning to move at a new pace. The population exploded from 70,000 in 1801 to 183,000 in 1841. Birmingham was becoming a city of specialists. One street made locks, the next screws, the next tools. Each area had its own identity. The men who ran these businesses were increasingly politically organized. The Birmingham Political Union, founded by Thomas Attwood in 1830, the political union campaigned for the 1832 Reform Act and won. Birmingham had shown that organized public opinion could change the law, but for Birmingham's workers, the reform was not enough. They had no vote. The Chartist movement found fertile ground here. In July 1839, Chartist riots in Bull Street turned violent. Troops were called in, and the Bull Ring itself was the scene of fighting. The Chartist movement ultimately failed to win its immediate demands, but it planted seeds that would flower in the reforms of the late Victorian era. By the middle of the Victorian age, Birmingham had given itself a monument in stone, a building that said, quietly but firmly, "We are here, and we intend to last." The columns rose not from wealth alone, but from something harder to name, a collective pride, earned slowly in workshops and counting houses and muddy yards across the city. Around it, the town gathered. Tradesmen, churchgoers, families on market days, people who did not think of themselves as history, but who were making it all the same. Carriages moved over damp cobbles. Gas lamps cast a pale glow on shop fronts, and in the spaces between the grand buildings, ordinary lives went quietly on, unrecorded, unhurried, and entirely real. These streets are still here. The stone has not moved, but the people who gave Birmingham its soul, they live now only in the echo of a city that has never stopped becoming. Charles Dickens visited Birmingham in 1844. He described it as a city of noise, smoke, and extraordinary energy. The Queen's visit in 1858 would validate everything, but by then, Birmingham's pride in itself was already absolute. By 1850, Birmingham's canal network totaled over 100 miles, more canals than Venice. The Nettlefold and Chamberlain factory, which would become GKN, drove screws into every building in the British Empire. In 1873, Joseph Chamberlain became mayor of Birmingham. He was 37 years old, and he intended to remake the entire city. Chamberlain began by municipalizing the gas supply, taking the gas company into public ownership, and using the profits to fund city improvements. Corporation Street opened in 1878, a wide modern boulevard lined with Victorian commercial buildings. Chamberlain became known as the Great Provider. He improved housing, sewage, schools, parks, and public libraries. Birmingham's Free Library opened in 1866, one of the first major public libraries in England, funded by the rates. The Birmingham School of Art opened in 1885, training craftsmen and designers who would carry Birmingham's reputation for quality into the new century. The Victoria Law Courts opened in 1891, a spectacular terracotta and brick landmark that remains one of Birmingham's finest buildings. By 1889, Birmingham had its own university, Mason Science College, which would become the University of Birmingham in 1900. Meanwhile, the factories kept growing. The BSA, Birmingham Small Arms, was founded in 1861 and would become one of the most important manufacturing companies in the world. The BSA produced everything from guns to bicycles to motorbikes, a perfect example of Birmingham's ability to adapt its manufacturing base. Ordinary Birmingham workers could now afford a bicycle, transforming their ability to travel to work and broadening their world. The chocolate factory of Cadbury, founded in Bourneville in 1879, offered a different model, the benevolent employer. George Cadbury built houses, parks, and sports facilities for his workers, a deliberate experiment in whether a good employer could create a better society. By 1891, Birmingham's population had reached 478,000. The city was expanding faster than any other in England outside London. The new suburbs, Edgbaston, Moseley, Handsworth, were developing as middle-class retreats, away from the smoke of the industrial centre. The tram network connected the suburbs to the city centre, first horse-drawn, then electrified from 1890. Electric trams brought a revolution in daily life. Workers could live further from their workplace and still afford to get there. Birmingham's civic ambition reached its peak in 1899. The council house, begun in 1874, was now complemented by a massive new civic quarter. In the 1890s, Birmingham's gunmakers were supplying rifles to the British Army's campaigns in Africa. The city was deeply entangled in empire. Birmingham's trades unions were growing, workers organizing for the first time into permanent associations that could bargain collectively. By 1900, Birmingham had over 200,000 manufacturing jobs in 3,000 separate firms. The city of Birmingham was formally granted city status in 1889, a recognition that this was not just a town, but one of the great cities of the world. As the century closed, Birmingham stood at the pinnacle of its industrial confidence. The question was, what would the 20th century bring? It would bring world wars, depression, renewal, and eventually a city that would find its identity again in the 21st century. Birmingham is not a city that looks backward for comfort. It always looked forward to the next trade, the next invention, the next generation. The workers who built this city, the smiths, the nailers, the jewelers, the gunmakers, the pen nib stampers, are gone. But their work remains. Every screw, every button, every gun, every engine, made here by people who asked only for fair pay and a chance to work. Beorma walked into this forest 1,400 years ago. He did not know what he was starting. But here it is, the second city of England. Birmingham, still growing, still making, still becoming. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, share it with someone who loves history. Subscribe for more journeys through Britain's past.